Today we're interviewing George Gerbner on Cultivation Theory. Thank you for meeting with me today, George. I'm eager to learn about your work on cultivation theory.
It's my pleasure. What would you like to know first?
Let's start with a little information on your background, George.
Well, I was born in Budapest, Hungary on August 8th, 1919. At a young age, I became interested in Hungarian literature, which led me to enroll in the University of Budapest. I then moved to California to earn my journalism degree from the University of California, Berkeley. After that, I was in the Army for a while during World War II, and then earned my master's degree in education and my PhD in communications at the University of Southern California. I then went on to become the Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania in 1964.
Seems like you have accomplished quite a bit in your lifetime. What started your development of cultivation theory?
Cultivation theory was developed in 1976 as part of a large-scale research project titled the Cultural Indicators Paradigm. This research was conducted for the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence in 1968 to 1969. The commission was established by an executive order issued by Lyndon B. Johnson on June 10, 1968, after the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. The research started with investigating violence in network television shows.
Wow, what an interesting start to your research. So tell us, what is the main idea behind cultivation theory?
Well, TV is one of the biggest sources that shapes today's society. TV shows are filled with symbols and messages that form people's views of reality and how they see the world. Violence is very common in television shows, and people who are exposed to many hours a week of TV shows containing violence are more susceptible to believe that the real world is a scary and mean place.
I understand that your cultural indicators paradigm has a three-pronged approach to analyze the effects of TV on the viewers.
That is correct. The first part of the process to understand TV's effects on viewers is called institutional process analysis. The goal of this analysis is to try and understand why the media chooses to produce the messages that they do. We want to try and uncover the practices of the media to see what is going on behind the scenes. For example, I have found that the media uses violence to gain profits at a low cost. Violence does not cost much to film and is pretty easily understood by the masses. Therefore, many shows include violence in their programming. The second prong is called message system analysis. Once we get a better idea of why the media is choosing to produce certain messages, the next step is to understand exactly what messages are broadcast. To do this, my team and I used quantitative content analysis.
That sounds interesting. Please tell me more.
Content analysis is the systematic, objective, quantitative analysis of message characteristics. This means that we are able to count how often violent acts occurred on television shows.
In order to do that, didn't you have to define what would count as violence in a TV show?
Yes. My definition of dramatic violence is the overt expression of physical force, compelling action against one's will on pain of being hurt and/or killed or threatened to be so victimized as part of the plot. This concludes with or without a weapon and against yourself or others.
How did you go about completing the content analysis for your research?
We developed what I call the Index of Violence. For many years, 1 week during the fall season, my team and I recorded every show that was on TV from 8 to 11 p.m. After watching and counting all depictions of violence that fit our definition, we used a formula to determine the overall level of violence. The results of the index were very steady from year to year, but also very high.
Those are some alarming results. What is the final prong to your approach?
That would be cultivation analysis. The point of this is to find evidence in favor of the hypothesis that those who are exposed to a lot of TV violence are more likely to view the real world as a violent and scary place.
How did you go about finding this evidence?
The research was conducted through surveys. The surveys included 2 different types of questions. There were questions that asked how much time respondents spent watching TV and questions about the respondents' perceived reality.
What were the major findings from the surveys?
First, there was a correlation between watching TV and fear of becoming a victim of crime. Those who said they watched 2 hours of TV a day or less said their odds of becoming a victim of violence were 1 out of 100. Those who watched 4 or more hours of TV a day said their odds of becoming a victim of violence were 1 out of 10. Second, it was found that respondents who watched 4 or more hours of TV a day thought that there was more police activity in society than light viewers did. Last, those who viewed 4 or more hours of TV daily chose answers to questions that categorized them as having suspicions about the motives of people.
Those are some great findings, George. Do you have any real-life examples of cultivation theory at work?
I do have an example that most people can relate to. I'm sure that everyone has watched something on TV or a movie that has made you scared in real life. I like to watch horror movies and thrillers, which often have a lot of violence in them. One movie I watched involved a woman that was driving home and her car was being followed. She couldn't lose the car following her, and she was eventually ran off the road and kidnapped. A few days after watching this movie, I was driving home late at night, and there was a car behind me that was making every single turn that I was. I became very nervous and scared. To my relief, the car finally turned onto a different road, and I made it home safe. Watching this film caused me to believe that something bad was going to happen to me in real life, when in reality, the person I thought was following me just lived near me. This is just one example, but over time, those who view a lot of violent TV programs can develop real fears about the world around them.
That's a great example, George. Now, I understand there have been lots of criticisms about cultivation theory. Would you like to address them?
Yes, there have been quite a few. Some of the main criticisms I have received are over my definition of violence, my categorization of light and heavy TV viewers, my choice to include all primetime TV programs in the cultivation analysis, regardless of the genre, and lastly, my use of surveys as the main form of research. There will always be people that don't agree with my work, but what I do have to say is this. My original research has been continued by others for almost 50 years now. There are very few theories in the mass communication field that have prompted so many studies. Since television is now one of our main sources of messages and information, the study of this information is very important to mankind's future.
Thank you so much for your time today, George. I'm sure we have all learned a lot.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.